Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Suggest one way in which psychological research might be considered socially sensitive. 2 marks. Here we have the command word suggest, which is asking for a briefer explanation of a particular concept or limitation. In this particular case, we're looking at a way in which psychological research is socially sensitive. Now, it's really important when we think about socially sensitive that this is about the research once it's been published, rather than the construction of the research and the design of the research. For the 2 marks available, we want to identify something about socially sensitive research and then apply that to a particular piece of research or a particular study. Let's have a look at a response. Sieber and Stanley suggests that the phrasing of the research question can be used to target specific groups within society, making them a target for prejudice and discrimination after the research has been published. Biological psychology has historically given rise to suggestions that there are gender or racial differences in intelligence that have led to the discrimination of groups and segregated education. We've identified a particular way in which research might be socially sensitive in terms of the research question. We've also explained why that then makes it socially sensitive, because it might target specific groups. We've gone to apply this to a particular area of psychology in terms of biological psychology, and we've given a specific instance in relation to this in terms of intelligence tests. So quite a lot here for our 2 marks. Explain alpha bias and suggest one limitation of alpha bias in the understanding of human behaviour. 4 marks. We have 2 different command words here. Firstly, we've got explain and then suggest. So we want to think of this question as 2 plus 2. 2 marks for explaining and 2 marks for suggesting. So with the command word explain, we need to give a detailed definition of our particular term. Here we want to explain the term alpha bias in order to show off our psychological knowledge. Alpha bias exaggerates the difference between men and women and often devalues one gender in relation to the other. Here we've looked at alpha bias in relation to gender, and we've been really clear that it exaggerates the difference between men and women. That's for our 1st mark, and then we've extended that definition a little bit, saying the consequence of it, that one gender is devalued in relation to the other. We're then going to the 2nd part of our question, to suggest a limitation of alpha bias. Now, when we're suggesting this, we need one limitation. There's no point in putting more than one down. And within that, we want to identify that limitation and then suggest or justify or explain why that is a limitation. Let's have a look at this limitation part of our question. Psychological research that has alpha bias in terms of gender continues the discrimination of women and sexist ideas. Darwin's view in evolutionary psychology that women are choosy ignores that women are as competitive and aggressive as men when certain situations arise. So we've identified a limitation in that it perpetuates discrimination and sexist ideas. We've then explained why that is a problem in relation to a specific research from evolutionary psychology. Now, you could use a different piece of research here to justify the same point, and that would be absolutely fine. Briefly evaluate one example of the influence of nature. 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need a detailed explanation. This is looking for a particular example and has some assumed psychological knowledge that we understand the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. We get 1 mark for identifying an appropriate example and a 2nd mark for explaining that in a bit of detail. Remember, it's key here that it's a brief explanation and only 2 marks. Let's have a look at a response. Genetic heritability demonstrates the influence of nature as specific behaviour or clinical conditions run in families, with parents and children showing the same characteristic. Gottsman and Shields found that the concordance rates for schizophrenia were 42% for monozygotic twins compared to 9% for dizygotic twins, with higher correlations for genetically identical twins showing the influence of genetics in the disorder. They identified genetic heritability as a particular factor in nature and explained what we mean by this key term. We've then used an example from Gottsman and Shields and their research into schizophrenia. If this isn't a topic that you've covered, you can use a different example of genetic heritability, including those from paper 1. Discuss reductionism and holism in psychology, 16 marks. Here we have the command word discuss, which is asking us to do 2 different skills. The first one is to explain. We need to explain all the key terminology in both reductionism and holism for our AO1 marks. There are 6 marks available for AO1, which means we need a detailed and range of knowledge in terms of the different concepts that make up reductionism and holism. Even though there's one command word, discuss, we still have 10 marks available for our evaluation, strengths and weaknesses of both reductionism and holism. We want to use examples across psychology in order to illustrate our points. Let's have a look at a response. We're going to start by explaining key terminology within the debate, focusing initially on reductionism. Reductionism analyses behaviour by breaking it down into its different parts, based around the scientific principle of parsimony. All behaviours should be explained using the most basic principles, and it typically uses more quantitative methods. Behavioural explanations of phobias focus on environmental reductionism, that phobias are acquired by classical conditioning and are maintained by operant conditioning. We've started our response with a simple definition and then linked this into other areas of the debate. We've also talked about that this idea of reductionism is on the most basic principles and the type of data it produces. Identifying different types of reductionism and linking this to specific approaches also shows off our psychological knowledge. It's now time to demonstrate our evaluation skills. The critique of environmental reductionism is based on its methodology, making it substantive, as much of the relevant research has made use of non-human animals as subjects. We've started off with a weakness of environmental reductionism in terms of its use of animals as participants. We could talk about this being animal reductionism as well. We then need to explore this in detail using examples in order to show our discussion skills. Critics of reductionism point to the social context in which humans are embedded from the earliest moments of life and to hard-to-measure factors like cognition, emotion, and intentionality. The impact of motivation is significant in human learning, with the presence of rewards not being sufficient if there is no motivation for them. We've identified or explained in more detail problems with environmental reductionism, focusing on our social context and how this impacts our behaviour, and different factors that are problematic to measure using reductionist ideas. We've made a specific reference to the role of learning theories in terms of motivation, which isn't taken into account in terms of behaviourists as an approach. To develop our logical chains of reasoning, we then want to move on to a strength of reductionism. However, the use of animals as participants enables psychological research to be more standardised within the exploration of behaviour. Skinner used animal participants to test the role of punishment to decrease the likelihood of behaviours being repeated. He tested the role of negative punishment with rats by having the heat turn off if the rats pulled the lever, so they learnt to avoid the lever within the cage. Identifying positives of reductionism is going to make us stand out as a candidate, and using animals makes it more standardised. We've used Skinner as an example here to tie in with learning theories and environmental reductionism, but you could use any study that uses animals. In this case as well, the reductionist position seems, if not clearly incorrect, then at least inadequate. We've identified that reductionism may be inadequate in order to explain human behaviour. Let's return to our explanation now, in terms of explaining a different concept within reductionism. Biological reductionism is a type of reductionism that sees all biological organisms made up of physical structures and processes and reduces human behaviour, no matter how complex, into terms of neurons, neurotransmitters and hormones. Whereas environmental reductionism reduces explanations of behaviour to basic stimulus and responses. We've given clear definitions of both biological reductionism and environmental reductionism in order to show our psychological knowledge of this debate. Let's return once again to evaluation. Biological reductionism has led to biological psychologists arguing that. Let's return once again to our evaluation. Biological reductionism has led biological psychologists to argue that OCD is caused by the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin. We've focused on a specific biological argument here, this time focusing on OCD being caused by neurotransmitters. Again, within your evaluation, you can use any examples that you feel confident explaining. We then want to explain the impact of a biologically reductionist point of view on biological therapies. Biological reductionism has led to the development of biological therapies such as drugs. For example, SSRIs are more effective than placebos at treating the symptoms of OCD and reduce the symptoms for up to 3 months after treatment, Sumeru et al., 2008. The use of SSRIs in patients with OCD has helped reduce the anxiety associated with OCD, thus providing relief for some patients. We've identified a specific biological therapy, in this case SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and specific research that says that this is effective, providing relief for patients in order to reduce their anxieties. In this evaluation paragraph, we've started with a strength, and so we're going to counter with a weakness. Some psychologists argue that biological reductionism can lead to errors of understanding because it ignores the complexity of human behaviour. For example, to treat conditions like ADHD with drugs, in the belief that the condition consists of nothing more than a neurochemical imbalance, is to mistake the symptoms of the phenomenon for its true cause. Ritalin may reduce these symptoms, but the conditions which gave rise to ADHD have not been addressed. Ignoring the complexity of human behaviour is the biggest criticism we can make of any form of reductionism. Here we've basically talked about the treatment etiology fallacy, and the fact that Ritalin, although might help alleviate ADHD, doesn't necessarily mean it's the cause of this particular clinical condition. We're going to complete our evaluation paragraph with a judgment. Whether or not this is true depends on what one thinks of as causation, but since success rates of drug therapy are so highly variable, the purely biological understanding seems inadequate. We've identified a different way in which reductionism is inadequate. The fact that causation is highly volatile and highly subjective, but also their variable rates in the effectiveness of particular drug therapies suggest that neurotransmitters in themselves may not be the cause of all clinical conditions. Let's return to our explanation once again. Most of psychology is based on the assumption that human behaviour can be studied effectively in relatively simple experiments, where complex behaviour is reduced to isolated variables, known as experimental reductionism. Our knowledge in this case has taken the form of experimental reductionism and giving an explanation of this type of reductionism. We're going to return once again to our evaluation. Experimental reductionism allows researchers to study the different factors that influence human behaviour in a controlled manner while establishing a causal relationship. We've given key benefits of experimental reductionism in terms of control and establishing cause and effect. It's now time to explain this in more detail. Laboratory experiments enable the control of extraneous variables so that cognitive psychologists can determine cause and effect relationships about the different nature of encoding between STM and LTM. In Baddeley's study, participants were tested individually, with each of the words in the word list being presented for 3 seconds to ensure that the participants completing the acoustically similar condition were comparable to the participants completing the semantically similar condition. We've identified laboratory experiments as a great way of researching psychological behaviours and having high levels of control. Lots of cognitive psychologists use this, although we could use other areas and other approaches. We've suggested that these psychologists have used this to test differences between STM and LTM, giving Baddeley's research as a particular example. This time our discussion is going to be extended by a further strength of reductionism. Furthermore, the use of reductionism allows simplistic models of memory to be created and understood in order for complex processes to be tested. By breaking memory down into sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, each store can be tested and compared in terms of capacity, coding, and duration in order to establish differences between them. The ability of reductionism to make simplistic models allows for testing, and we've talked specifically about the multi-store model here as an example of a simplistic model. You could talk about working memory or another type of memory in order to illustrate the point. To complete this discussion, we're going to give another judgment. Therefore, the scientific rigour of psychology is established by reductionism, as it enables the effect of different variables to be tested. Here we've connected a use of reductionism to psychology as a science and how it's enabled by this other process. It's time to return once again to our explanation of reductionism. We've covered reductionism in detail, so it's now time to tackle holism. Holism is attempting to understand human behaviour by analysing the person or behaviour rather than its constituent. We need to remember that this question is asking us both about reductionism and holism, and so we need to explain holism for some of our AO1 marks. Holism is attempting to understand human behaviour by analysing the person or behaviour rather than its constituent parts. It typically uses more qualitative methods. For example, Gestalt psychologists claim the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and it's inappropriate breaking up behaviour as it should be viewed as a whole. We've clearly given the guiding principles of holism in terms of analysing behaviour as a whole. We've identified Gestalt psychologists as a particular example of a psychological approach that is using holistic ideas. Let's move into evaluation one more time. Humanism is unique in its holistic approach to explaining human behaviour that seeks to develop a holistic understanding of the individual and the extent to which different factors explain a given behaviour. We've clearly made a connection between humanism as an approach and holism as a debate. We're then going to explain this in a bit more detail. The assumptions within humanism have had a significant impact on counselling psychology, as Rogers claims that psychological problems are the result of the conditions of worth. He encourages that counsellors act as facilitators for individuals negotiating their own problems rather than being directive and imposing their power. We've clearly explained the impact of humanism on counselling psychology, identifying Rogers and key terminology within Rogers' ideas on counselling to demonstrate holism as a particular way of viewing behaviour. We're going to explain a different example of holism in order to elaborate on this further. Moreover, interactionism looks to treat schizophrenia by combining antipsychotics with CBTP, so that an individual is rational enough to engage with identifying and challenging irrational thought processes and homework, as well as a combination of biological and non-biological explanations to give a holistic explanation of schizophrenia. A genetic predisposition due to DISC1 variant is activated by environmental stressors such as an overbearing and hostile family relationships. Our examples of holism here have come from interactionism, and wherever you can employ interactionism is going to work here. We've gone for schizophrenia as a topic that we've looked at, combining both different treatments and different explanations in order to explain schizophrenia as a clinical condition. Let's complete our discussion with a judgment. Therefore, holism acknowledges that we cannot predict behaviour by just understanding individual variables or components. The relationship between making predictions and understanding human behaviour is a real niche idea in terms of holism. We're going to complete our essay by giving some concluding remarks. The use of animals in order to observe their more simplistic behaviours fails to take into account the motivation behind behaviour. Reductionism has led to significant advancements in treatments that reduce symptoms that have a positive contribution for society. Isolating variables enables psychologists to test relationships to establish causality. And finally, examining a range of contributing factors to provide an in-depth insight into an individual's behaviour enables a greater understanding of the impact and causes of behaviour. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.